a continuation of politics by any other means, toponymic wars in Czechia in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I very much prefer personal in-person conferences, but I'm one of those who could not have participated had it not been online. So I'm glad I could join and can share some of my research. My topic is rather different from my predecessor. I'm going to talk about a contemporary issue, which many of you have probably come across as well in your countries, and that is the anthroponymic and toponymic consequences or reactions to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm going to talk about the situation in the Czech Republic, particularly focusing on one specific case, which nevertheless, I think shows some very interesting aspects of names. I'm an anthropologist, not a linguist. I'm interested in linguistic anthropology, and more generally, I guess I'm interested in how language structures our understanding of the world. And so I approach names as expressions of our relationship with the world, and how we make ourselves at home in the world. As I mentioned, there have toponymic reactions to Russia have been numerous all across the world, and not just in the last year. I give some examples of cases which precedes the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but of course last year was particularly I guess important for renaming, motivated by the invasion. Pretty much every country, almost every country in Europe and other parts of the world has at least attempted to change some names, in many instances, many names. These cases that I'm listing on the slide all involve public spaces in the immediate vicinity of the Russian embassy or consulate in that particular country, but other spaces have also been renamed, which have nothing to do with the immediate presence of Russian embassy or a Russian company, etc. In the Czech Republic, the last two cases were from Prague, and in the Czech Republic there have been many reactions of different kinds to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Defacement of statues, which some of them still exist from the communist times, some perhaps a Russian general who participated in the liberation of Czechoslovakia after World War II, etc. So many statues were defaced. There was a lot of graffiti and street art performances. You can see the wall of the Russian embassy in Prague, and the graffiti says "the embassy of hell." There have been different reactions, defacement of statues, graffiti like the one I'm showing, street art, statue of Putin on a golden stool, or a hailing on a gas pipe. Anyway, honorary citizenships given to people like Gagarin, Tereshkova, Konev, and other Russian personalities have been removed, and many new words were coined. But what I'm going to talk about today is actually and I hope you're seeing this new slide now, is the toponymic reaction, that is renaming of streets. Okay, thank you. There have been many attempts at renaming, and some have been successful. These are some of the few that have been successful. And even in places where it was not successful officially, there have been many guerrilla renaming, like you see the Ukrainian flag on the name of Russian street, or these guerrilla renaming in Prague, renaming various public spaces after Volodymyr Zelensky, Alexei Navalny, Anna Politkovskaya, and other Russian dissidents and or Ukrainian representatives, etc. I'm going to talk specifically about one particular case, which occurred in a small town north of Prague with about 36,000 inhabitants. It is located in the former Sudeten area, former German-speaking. As you know, the German population was removed from Czechoslovakia after World War II, and new settlers moved in from other parts of Czechoslovakia. It is a peripheral location, but fairly prosperous. Nevertheless, the overall image of the region is that it is marginalized, economically disadvantaged, which then affected the discussion that I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. The town council came with the proposition to rename two streets in the town, one called Russian Street and the other Moscow Street. And they proposed to return to names which these streets bore before the communists took over Czechoslovakia in 1948. However, this was a German-speaking town, so these names were actually German. The original names were German. And this also played out a little bit, affected the debate about the proposal. A spoiler, this attempt failed. The streets were never renamed, but I still believe that it is very important to look at the discussion that accompanied this attempt and what we can learn from it about the importance of names in structure our understanding of space, but also of people who live in that space, how we view the space and each other. What I did was I looked at one particular debate, internet debate, which followed an article published online on April 21st last year. The name of the article is "Neighbors Got into an Argument Over the Renaming of Russian and Moscow Street." The debate lasted from April to June for about 2 months. It contained over 1,400 debate contributions by approximately 950 individuals. There's, of course, a possible question whether an analysis of an internet debate is valid because we don't know how representative the participants of the debate are of the larger population, but there are many studies have been carried out which actually tackle this issue, like Albrecht in 2006, who found out that actually there's a very close correspondence between who participates in internet debates and the larger public. And I actually verified that in my own research on other topics. So I think we can take this material as a good representation of public opinions and interpretations of the value of names. I coded individual debate contributions using 17 different codes, grouped into 5 code groups. And I will now try to share some of the findings that I came to after analyzing the debate. I exclude from the following analysis the other group of arguments, which often were insults or some off-topic, which had really nothing to do with the problem at hand. And I will only talk about the 4 primary code groups or code group of arguments: pragmatic, symbolic, historical, and domestic politics. The most frequent one were pragmatic arguments, and I will shortly show what I mean by that. And then, as you see, the percentages, the frequency decreased, but still all of these groups of arguments presented a very substantial proportion of all arguments. So all bore significant influence on the debate and showed what people associate with names, which at face value might seem rather innocent. The pragmatic arguments, and I call them pragmatic because they were, at least on face value, they were presented as non-ideological. Just look at the problem and try to find a solution. So, you know, changing the name is a waste of money, it's a waste of time, it's a waste of energy. We could use that energy better by sending support to Ukraine, material support, military support to Ukraine. Another group of arguments, the changing of your documents is such a nightmare that it's not worth it. Let's just keep the documents, let's just keep the names and not have to go through the nightmare of changing all our documents. Then there was an important group of arguments saying the change should be decided on by the residents of those particular streets, and people from the outside, be they even from the same city or outside of the city, should not be able to vote in that respect. And finally, there was a small group of arguments saying, well, the change of documents is not really that difficult, and even if it is a smaller sacrifice than what Ukrainians have to go through every day. All of these together made up about 1/3 of the arguments. So they were important, most frequent, but by no means the majority. Other factors also play in. First of all is the symbolic value of names. A large number of debaters argued that it was important to remove these names because they evoke or legitimize oppressive regimes, aggressive wars, etc. In this particular case, in the case of Russian invasion, but in other cases as well. So we should get rid of all of these names. Other people may have agreed with that, but then they said, well, but if we do that, we will behave just like the communists did in 1948 when they renamed all streets which were not supportive of the communist regime. We should just keep the names as they are, even if we don't like them, because who knows what happens in a few years, and if we won't have to rename all of the streets again. And then there was a group of arguments which I labeled as the Russian ice cream argument. I'm not sure how well known this type of ice cream is in your countries. In the Czech Republic, Russian ice cream is a product called Russian ice cream. I don't know whether it actually has anything to do with Russia, but it is called Russian ice cream. 2 waffles and ice cream in between. Is very popular. But the association with Russia after the Russian invasion led to the debates what we should do with it, and should we call it Russian ice cream. And then there are other products also associated with Russia, like the Russian egg, as you can see on the picture, or the Moscow bread. And then these other arguments continued, okay, so then should we also rename people who are called Boris, Ivan, Igor, who have Czechs who have Russian names? Should we rename them as well? Should we rename Pushkin Street? Should we rename Gagarin Street as well, just because they're associated with Russia? Now, stepping aside, one Ukrainian colleague told me that they have a saying in Ukraine which goes like this: first comes Pushkin Street, and then comes the Russian tank. So coming back to this, so these types of arguments extending, kind of trying to ridicule or push to the absurd this debate about renaming of the streets, and bringing in all other cultural matters, cultural debates, cultural values into the debate. And the Russian ice cream was actually renamed to Ukrainian ice cream by one company. So this, in a way, absurd debate actually entered real life and made some impact. Then there was a group of arguments which I summed up under historical argument group. Either Russia as an evil force which oppressed Czechoslovakia for 40 years, or Soviet Union, but there's a pretty much in the Czech popular consciousness, Russia equals Soviet Union, or Soviet Union equals Russia. So this was a very significant argument in favor of changing the names. 1968 in particular, the Russian, or the occupation of, or invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact armies, which again equaled Soviet armies, was very frequently mentioned. Or then there were arguments, you know, Ukraine is the same as Russia. Why should we care about Ukraine? Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union in 1968 during the invasion, was born in Ukraine. Is he Ukrainian or not? I mean, they're all the same. And then there was an argument in favor of keeping the names, bringing to mind the Red Army liberation of a large part of Czechoslovakia in 1945. So all these historical interpretations, bringing in also Germany and the German-speaking population of the Sudeten areas as another factor. And then there was last group of arguments, domestic politics. Some said the proponents of the renaming are just political opportunists who want to show off, make a name for themselves, maybe try to look good in front of the EU officials. There's a strong anti-EU, anti-NATO, anti-the West rhetoric associated with that. A lot of criticism of the current government, which is kind of right-wing, strongly pro-EU, pro-NATO, pro-Western, I guess we might say, and very critical of Russia. So these things played out, and political identities, political partisanships. As I mentioned, this is a Sudeten area, which was the original population was removed, new population moved in. It is perceived as being a communist population majoritarily in their majority. So there was a lot of criticism of the Communist Party, and be it in the past or in the present, which is still very popular in the Sudeten areas. And then there was a final type of argument, which is very frequent today in the debates. You know, if you support Ukraine, go fight. Why don't you go fight there? Or, you know, immigrate to Russia if you like Russian street so much, etc. So this is another group of arguments. A very rich, multi-layered debate on a seemingly very banal topic in a small town in northern Bohemia. If I can generalize, there were many different threads within that debate. You know, somebody added a contribution, and then there were reactions to that. And so many threads were very long, and they usually had this development. It started with a pragmatic argument like, well, we shouldn't put these people through the trouble of changing their documents. And somebody would read, well, but the change of the documents is not that difficult. And even if it were, I mean, you have to look at the symbolic value of the name, and we shouldn't commemorate oppressive, aggressive regimes. But we would be as bad as the communists. Well, but what about 1968? What about 40 years of communism? I mean, shouldn't we pay attention to that? We moved to the historic, and then said, well, but you know, the communists were bad, but current government is even worse. And look at the inflation, look at energy costs, and you know, we cannot, we shouldn't support it. And so we had ended up in domestic politics. So this is kind of a cycle, and then it spiraled many times, sometimes around. What can we take out of it? And this is my last slide. What can we take away from this? There have been many texts about street naming, street name changes, politics of naming on different issues, case studies, as well as theoretical thinking. And I just bring out a few of them. Adenbawi, Sisya Ülke Tögös wrote about the role of street names in international relations. They show that in the case of Adenbawi in Nigeria, in the case of the other authors in Ankara in Turkey, how street names are perhaps used as a way of catering to or criticizing a foreign government, pleasing or criticizing a foreign government using street naming. And we saw that in the first slide with all the names of public spaces in front of the Russian embassies. This is a clear example. But the example that I talked about is on face value, it may look like that, but actually it's, as we have seen, is much more rich, much more complicated, and actually I think much more interesting in that, because it shows us how multi-layered the debates about street names may be, and how people view the same object differently depending on their political standing, on their place of residence, on their value hierarchy or value priorities, etc. More, I think in this particular case that I talked about, looking at urban streetscape as a political cosmos is a more fitting description. We could see all these different identities, historical memories, cultural preferences, all coming to one. And so this small town is a microcosmos of the Czech political cosmos, and the debate about street naming, the two street names, actually has been a debate about Czech political identity, who we are, who we want to be as a nation, and how can we move on from here? What would be the proper course? So it was not about Russia, it was about Czechs. And that's why it was more a proxy war than an actual conflict over Russia and Ukraine. And I'm running out of time, so I will move on to the last slide. Thank you very much for your attention. I will be happy to answer any questions you might have. And thank you for the opportunity to share this with you.
Thank you. That was great. So interesting. So we'll wait and see if some people have questions. I was very curious, as you were talking about this particular issue, do street names change often for other reasons? Here in the United States, it's unusual for street names to change in smaller towns, I would think, whereas in large cities, they will often rename a street, as these were, to honor someone or to commemorate an event. But there are so many practical considerations, as you saw. It's just hard to change it. So do street names change often or very infrequently?
Currently, very infrequently. There have been many waves of renaming. The first one started already under the Austrian or Austro-Hungarian Empire in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Then when Czechoslovakia was created in 1918, then there was a wave of renaming, getting rid of the Habsburg associated names. Then in 1939, after Germany annexed or occupied whatever was left of Czechoslovakia, there was a wave of renaming. In 1945, another wave after World War II. Then in 1948, communists took over, so there was a wave of renaming. And then in 1989, when the communist regime fell, then there was the last big wave of renaming, which nevertheless mostly affected the principal streets and main squares, while the less prominent streets were not renamed so frequently. So there are still many communist names in Czech cities, but not on the main streets or main squares, the side, maybe side streets, etc. And often the argument was that, you know, we don't want to go through the trouble of changing our documents. But as you saw, there's much more to it, and the document argument is often just a cover-up for something else, or an excuse for something else.
That makes sense. Totally makes sense. Great, thank you. Other questions or comments from anyone else in the audience?
I would like to ask a question also, if I may.
Go ahead.
Yes, so my question would be first, who were the initiators in this case, the society people of those changes of the street names, or does it come more from the political power or for those governing people?
In this particular case, there were some citizens of the town who proposed the change. They came to the mayor and asked her to consider the change. Then this change was discussed in the city council. The council voted in favor of the change, but for some reason it didn't consult it with the people who were affected by the change. So then they learned about the rule, the decision, protested against it. Then there was another council meeting. They discussed it, and then at the end the council organized an online poll. But it was kind of problematic because it wasn't clear who is allowed to vote in the poll, but the poll ended in favor of, or it denied the change, or ended with the denial of the change. So it's about 63% of the people who voted in the poll voted against the name change. In the Czech Republic, the power to name streets rests with the city council, not the central government, not the regional government. It's the city council only.
And secondly, one more short question, if I may. For me, it's very interesting that you said that historically there were some other periods, let's say also renaming the streets named after Habsburg dynasty and so on and so on. Did you notice by the research any similarities or something different, between these renamings? Let's say the current one now from Russian, and between the Habsburg family dynasty renaming processes?
Yes, actually, yes, I have. In another research that we did, it concerned the city of Těšín. It's on the border between the Czech Republic and Poland, but originally it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austrian part of the monarchy, and it was divided in two cities after the creation of Czechoslovakia and Poland, and a brief war between the two countries in 1919. And in 1920, the city was divided. And so we did an analysis of place name changes or street name changes in this town on both sides of the border to see what happened. We studied the city council proceedings from that period, 1920s, 1930s, and there was a lot of parallel between what I just talked about and those times. Often the same discussions, different arguments put forth in defense or against the change, and a lot of historical memory and historical arguments coming into play, and actually I would say more so than the pragmatic arguments that perhaps prevail so much today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Good questions. I think that's all we have time for. So thank you so much for that great presentation. Super interesting, and I hope you can stick around to hear some more of our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.